The phone rang at 2 in the morning, and Damien Cross knew before he answered that something was wrong. His grandfather's nurse was on the other end, her voice shaking. "Come now," she said. "He does not have much time left." Damien drove through empty streets faster than he should have, his knuckles white on the wheel, his mind refusing to accept what he already understood. By the time he reached the old house on the hill, the doctor was already standing in the hallway with a face that told him everything. His grandfather, Edmund Cross, was sitting up in bed, propped against pillows, his breathing slow and uneven. The old man's eyes found Damien the moment he walked in, and there was something urgent in them, something that had nothing to do with sickness. "Sit down," Edmund whispered. "There is something I must tell you before I go, and you will not like it." Damien sat beside the bed, gripping his grandfather's hand. "Whatever it is, we can deal with it later. Right now you need to rest." "There is no later," Edmund said. "Listen to me. Years ago, before you were born, I made a mistake that has cost this family everything. I took something from Victor Voss that was never mine to take. Land, money, a business he built with his own hands. I destroyed him to build what we have now." Damien frowned. He had grown up hearing the name Voss spoken like a curse in his house. He knew the Voss family as rivals, as enemies, as people his father warned him never to trust. He had never once heard the story from the other side. "I have carried this guilt for 40 years. Edmund continued. "And now it is time to make it right, before I face whatever comes next. There is only one way to end this properly, a marriage between our families. Victor has a daughter, Elena. You will marry her, and the debt between our houses will finally be settled." Damien pulled his hand back as though it had been burned. "Grandfather, you cannot be serious. You want me to marry the daughter of a man my own father despises? A man who would probably spit on our name if he saw it written on a wall?" Edmund's grip tightened with surprising strength. "This is not a request, Damien. This is the last thing I will ever ask of you. I need to know that before I close my eyes, this wound will begin to heal. Promise me." Damien stared at the man who had raised him more than his own father ever had. The man who had taught him how to ride a bicycle, how to fish, how to stand tall when the world tried to knock him down. He could not refuse him now, not with death sitting so close in the room. "I promise," Damien said, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. Edmund smiled faintly, relief washing over his tired face. "Then find Victor Voss tomorrow. Tell him what I told you. He will resist at first, but remind him of the letter I left with my lawyer. He will understand." 3 hours later, Edmund Cross passed away in his sleep, and Damien was left standing in a quiet room, carrying a promise he did not know how to keep. Across the city, in a very different kind of house, Elena Voss was arguing with her father for the 3rd time that week. The Voss family lived more modestly now than they once had, in a house that still held traces of old wealth but none of its comfort. Victor Voss sat in his study surrounded by papers, his face lined with the exhaustion of a man who had spent decades trying to rebuild something that had been torn apart from under him. "I am not asking you to like it," Victor said, his voice low and controlled. "I am telling you it must happen. The Cross family destroyed everything I built. This marriage is the only way we recover what was taken." Elena crossed her arms, refusing to sit. "So your solution is to hand me over to the son of the man who ruined you?" "Father, listen to yourself." "It is not like that," Victor said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Edmund Cross reached out through his lawyer weeks ago. He wants to make amends before he dies. His grandson will inherit everything. If you marry him, our family name rises again. Everything I lost, you will have access to. Do you understand what that means for our future?" "I understand that you are selling me like property," Elena said sharply. Victor's jaw tightened. "If you refuse, I will have no choice but to cut you off completely. No home, no name, no support. I have fought too long and too hard to let pride ruin this chance. You will marry Damien Cross, or you will leave this house tonight with nothing." Elena stood frozen, staring at her father, searching his face for some sign that he did not mean it. But there was none. Victor Voss had spent his life clawing his way back from ruin, and he was not going to let his daughter's feelings stand in the way of restoring his family's name. She turned without another word and walked out of the study, her chest tight with anger and fear. In her room, she sat on the edge of her bed and stared out the window at the dark street below, wondering how her life had turned into something she no longer recognized. The next morning, Damien arrived at the Voss house dressed in a plain gray suit, carrying none of the confidence he usually wore like armor. He had rehearsed what he would say a dozen times in the car, but none of the words felt right. Victor Voss opened the door himself, and the two men stood staring at each other for a long moment, decades of hostility hanging in the air between them. I suppose you know why I am here, Damien said finally. Victor's expression was unreadable. Come in. They sat across from each other in a small living room that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. Damien explained his grandfather's final wish, the debt Edmund had confessed to, and the marriage proposed as a way to finally close old wounds. Victor listened without interrupting, his hands folded tightly in his lap. When Damien finished speaking, Victor was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your grandfather ruined my life once already. Now, even from his grave, he tries to control it again. I am not my grandfather," Damien said, "and I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am telling you what he wanted, and I intend to honor it, whether either of us likes it or not." Victor studied him carefully, as though trying to decide whether Damien meant what he said. Finally, he nodded slowly. "My daughter will not be pleased. But if this marriage restores what was taken from this family, then it will happen. I will speak with her." That afternoon, Elena was called into the study again, and this time, her father did not raise his voice. He simply told her the arrangements had been made. The wedding would take place within the month. There would be no negotiations, no delays, no room for refusal. Elena listened in silence, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. When her father finished speaking, she asked only one question. "Does he know how much I hate this?" Victor did not answer. Later that evening, Elena stood in front of her mirror, staring at her own reflection, as though searching for the girl she used to be before all of this began. She thought of the life she had imagined for herself, one built on her own choices, her own love, her own future. Now all of it was being decided by two men who barely spoke to each other with respect. Meanwhile, across the city, Damien sat alone in his grandfather's study, surrounded by old photographs and dusty books, trying to make sense of the promise he had made. He picked up a framed picture of Edmund as a young man, smiling beside a woman Damien did not recognize. He wondered how many secrets his family still kept buried, how many more truths would surface before this was over. His assistant and closest friend Lucas arrived later that night to check on him, finding Damien staring blankly at the fireplace. "You look like a man walking toward his own execution," Lucas said, sitting across from him. Damien managed a tired smile. That might not be far from the truth. Lucas listened as Damien explained everything. The debt, the promise, the marriage that neither he nor Elena wanted. When he finished, Lucas leaned back, considering his words carefully. "You know this could destroy you," Lucas said. "Marrying into a family that hates yours. Living under the same roof as someone who probably resents you before you even say a word to her." "I know," Damien said quietly. "But I made a promise to a dying man. I intend to keep it, no matter what it costs me." Lucas studied his friend for a long moment. "Then I hope, for both your sakes, that there is more to this than debt and duty. Because a marriage built only on obligation rarely survives contact with real life." Damien said nothing, but the words settled uncomfortably in his chest, refusing to leave. Over the following days, the arrangements moved quickly. Lawyers exchanged documents. Families that had avoided each other for decades were forced into the same rooms to discuss wedding details neither side wanted to plan. Elena barely spoke during these meetings, sitting stiffly beside her father, her eyes avoiding Damien's whenever their gazes threatened to meet. Damien noticed her silence, the tightness in her shoulders, the way her hands stayed clenched in her lap. He recognized the same trapped feeling he carried himself, though neither of them said a word about it to the other. One afternoon, as the meeting ended and the families prepared to leave, Damien found himself alone with Elena for the first time, waiting in a hallway while their fathers finished a private conversation behind closed doors. "I know you did not choose this," Damien said quietly, breaking the silence between them. Elena turned to look at him, her expression guarded. "Neither did you, from what I understand." "No," Damien admitted. "But that does not make it easier for either of us." Elena studied him for a long moment, as though trying to decide whether he meant what he said, or whether it was simply another performance meant to smooth over an ugly situation. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I will marry you because I have no other choice, but do not expect me to pretend this is anything other than what it is, a transaction between two families who despise each other." Damien nodded slowly, accepting her words without argument. "Understood." They stood in silence after that, the space between them thick with everything neither of them wanted to say. When their fathers finally emerged from the study, Elena walked past Damien without another glance, leaving him standing alone in the hallway, staring after her with a strange, unfamiliar ache in his chest that he could not explain. That night, as Damien drove home through the quiet streets, he found himself thinking about the brief moment they had shared, the sharpness in her voice, the sadness hidden just beneath it. He told himself it meant nothing, that it was simply two strangers, bound together by circumstances neither of them controlled. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered that nothing about this arrangement would turn out to be as simple as either of them expected. Back at the Voss house, Elena climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her older brother, Owen, was waiting for her at the top, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He had heard everything from their father earlier that day, and the anger on his face was obvious. "Tell me this is some kind of joke," Owen said. "Tell me father did not just agree to hand you over to a cross." "It is not a joke," Elena said quietly, brushing past him toward her room. "I wish it were." Owen followed her, refusing to let the conversation end. "You cannot actually go through with this. Do you have any idea what that family did to us? What they did to grandfather, to this house, to everything we used to have?" "I know the story," Elena snapped, spinning around to face him. "I have heard it my whole life. But right now, none of that changes anything. Father made his decision, and I do not have the luxury of refusing it." Owen's expression softened slightly, though his frustration remained. "Then let me talk to him. Let me try to change his mind." "You can try," Elena said, her voice tired. "But you know how he gets when he believes something is the only way forward. He has already decided this will fix everything he lost. He will not listen to either of us." Owen fell silent, watching his sister with a mixture of anger and helplessness. Finally, he asked the question that had been sitting heavy in his mind since he first heard the news. "Do you think there is any chance this Damien person is different from the rest of his family?" Elena thought of the brief conversation in the hallway earlier that day, the quiet honesty in his voice when he admitted that he had not chosen this either. She pushed the memory aside quickly, unwilling to let herself soften toward a man she was supposed to resent. "It does not matter what he is like," she said finally. "He is still a cross, and I will not forget what that name has cost this family, no matter how kind his words might sound." Owen studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, though doubt still lingered in his eyes. "Just be careful, Elena. Marriages built on old wounds rarely end without more pain." Elena did not answer. She simply closed her bedroom door and sat alone in the darkness, staring at the wedding date circled in red on the calendar across her room, wondering how many more sacrifices her family's pride would demand of her before it was finally satisfied. Meanwhile, Damien sat in his grandfather's empty study long after Lucas had gone home, staring at the folder of legal documents that would soon bind his life to a stranger's. He thought about his father, Gerald Cross, who had been away on business during the entire arrangement, and who would likely erupt in anger the moment he learned what Edmund had demanded before his death. Damien was not wrong to worry. The following morning, Gerald returned from his trip and stormed into the house the moment he heard the news from the household staff. He found Damien in the study, and his voice thundered through the quiet house. "Tell me this is not true," Gerald said, slamming the door behind him. "Tell me you have not agreed to marry a Voss." "I gave my word to grandfather before he died," Damien said calmly, though his heart pounded in his chest. "I intend to keep it." Gerald's face turned red with fury. "Your grandfather was a dying old man consumed by guilt that clouded his judgment. That family destroyed everything we worked to build. Now you want to hand them a seat at our table?" "I want to honor a promise," Damien said firmly, standing to meet his father's anger head-on. "This is not about forgiveness or guilt. It is about closing a chapter that has poisoned this family for 40 years. Gerald stared at his son for a long moment, searching for some sign of weakness he could exploit. Finding none, he exhaled sharply and turned away, his shoulders tense with barely restrained anger. "This marriage will bring nothing but trouble into this house," Gerald said quietly, almost to himself. "Mark my words, Damien. Blood like theirs does not simply wash away with a wedding ceremony." Damien said nothing as his father left the room, but the warning settled deep in his chest, joining the quiet unease that had been building there since the night his grandfather made his final request. He glanced once more at the framed photograph on the desk, Edmund's tired but hopeful smile staring back at him, and wondered if keeping this promise would heal his family or tear it apart completely. Outside, the sky had turned a deep shade of orange as evening approached, and somewhere across the city, in a house filled with old grudges and quiet grief, Elena Voss stared at the same darkening sky, both of them unaware of how deeply their fates had already begun to intertwine. The morning of the wedding arrived under a sky the color of old steel, and the tension inside the Cross estate could be felt the moment the first guests began to arrive. Rows of chairs had been arranged in the garden, white flowers lining the aisle, and yet nothing about the atmosphere felt celebratory. Guests whispered among themselves as members of the Voss family took their seats on one side, while the Cross family occupied the other, the two sides separated by more than just a walkway. Elena stood in a small dressing room upstairs, staring at her reflection in a tall mirror. Her wedding dress was elegant, simple, and entirely chosen by someone else, since her father had insisted on approving every detail, to make certain nothing embarrassed the family name. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her, pale and composed on the outside, trembling with quiet dread on the inside. Her friend Nora, who had known her since childhood and worked now as her personal assistant, stood beside her, adjusting the veil with careful hands. "You do not have to smile for me," Nora said softly. "I know how much you do not want this." Elena managed a small, humorless laugh. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who has known you long enough to see through it," Nora replied. She hesitated, then added gently, "For what it is worth, I have heard the staff talking. They say Damien Cross is not like his father. Some even say he seems as trapped in this as you are." Elena's eyes flickered toward the mirror again, unreadable. "That does not change anything. Trapped or not, he is still marrying me because his family owes mine an old debt. There is nothing romantic hiding underneath that." Nora said nothing more, simply finishing the final adjustments to the veil before stepping back to look at her friend with quiet sympathy. Downstairs, in a separate room, Damien stood in front of another mirror, adjusting his tie with hands that felt strangely unsteady. Lucas stood nearby, watching him with a mixture of concern and dark amusement. "You look like a man preparing to face a firing line," Lucas said, trying to lighten the mood. "That might be an accurate description," Damien replied dryly. Lucas stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen, I know this is not the wedding you imagined for yourself, but whatever happens today, you are doing this for the right reasons. That has to count for something." Damien exhaled slowly, staring at his own reflection. "I keep telling myself that. I am not sure it helps very much." Before Lucas could respond, a soft knock interrupted them, and an assistant informed Damien that it was time. He took one last breath, straightened his jacket, and walked out toward the garden where his future, however unwanted, waited for him beneath a canopy of white flowers. The ceremony began with quiet formality. Both fathers sat in the front rows, their expressions carefully neutral, though anyone paying close attention could see the tension coiled tightly beneath their calm exteriors. Victor Voss watched his daughter walk down the aisle with an unreadable mixture of pride and guilt, while Gerald Cross observed his son with barely concealed disapproval. Elena walked slowly toward the altar, her eyes fixed forward, refusing to look at the rows of unfamiliar faces watching her every step. When she finally reached Damien, their eyes met for the first time that day, and something unexpected passed between them, quick and startling, though neither of them acknowledged it outwardly. The officiant began speaking the traditional words, his voice calm and practiced, unaware of the storm of unspoken tension surrounding the two people standing before him. Damien and Elena repeated their vows in steady, controlled voices, each word feeling foreign and distant, as though they belonged to two different people entirely. When it came time to exchange rings, Damien took Elena's hand gently, sliding the ring onto her finger. The moment their skin touched, a strange warmth shot through both of them, sudden and unexplainable, like a spark passing quietly between two wires. Elena's breath caught slightly, and Damien's jaw tightened, both of them dismissing the sensation as simple nervousness, though neither quite believed that explanation. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and polite applause rippled through the garden, though it lacked any real warmth. Damien and Elena turned to face their guests, forcing smiles onto their faces for the sake of appearances, both keenly aware of how empty the gesture felt. The reception that followed was equally strained. Round tables were arranged carefully to keep the two families at a respectful distance from one another, though occasional sharp glances still passed between relatives, who remembered old grievances too well to forget them for a single afternoon. Waitstaff moved quietly between tables, refilling glasses, while soft music played in the background, failing to soften the underlying tension in the air. Elena sat beside Damien at the head table, both of them maintaining careful, polite distance despite their new marital status. When it came time for the customary first dance, Damien extended his hand toward her, and she accepted it with visible reluctance, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor while dozens of eyes watched their every move. "You do not have to pretend to enjoy this," Elena said quietly as they moved slowly to the music, her voice barely above a whisper. "Neither do you," Damien replied, matching her tone. They danced in silence for a moment, neither speaking, both intensely aware of the strange warmth radiating from where their hands touched. Elena tried to keep her expression neutral, but she could not ignore the way her heartbeat quickened whenever Damien's hand tightened slightly around hers. "I know this is not what you wanted for your life," Damien said eventually, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "No," Elena admitted, "it is not. I am sorry for that," he said, truly. Elena studied his face carefully, searching for any hint of insincerity, but found none. "Save your apologies," she said finally. "Words will not undo what our families have done to each other over the years." Damien nodded, accepting her words without argument, though something in his chest tightened uncomfortably at the coldness in her voice. The song ended, and they separated quickly, returning to their respective seats, the brief moment of unexpected closeness already fading beneath the weight of everything unspoken between them. As the reception continued, Victor Voss approached Gerald Cross near the edge of the garden, both men holding drinks they had barely touched. "I hope you understand," Victor said quietly, "that this marriage does not erase what your family did to mine." Gerald's expression remained cold. "And I hope you understand that my son is only doing this out of respect for a dying man's wishes. Do not mistake this union for reconciliation between our families." Victor's jaw tightened. "Then we understand each other perfectly." The two men parted without another word, their brief exchange confirming what both families already suspected. Whatever peace this marriage was meant to create existed only on paper, a fragile agreement built over decades of unresolved resentment. Later that evening, as guests began to leave and the garden emptied of its temporary decorations, Damien and Elena found themselves standing alone near the edge of the property, watching the last of the sunlight disappear behind the horizon. "I suppose this is real now," Elena said quietly, staring out at the darkening sky. "It is," Damien agreed. She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable in the fading light. "I meant what I said earlier. I will honor this marriage because I have no other choice, but do not expect anything more than that from me." Damien held her gaze steadily. "I am not expecting anything, Elena. I only hope that somewhere down this road, we can find a way to make this bearable for both of us." Elena said nothing in response, though something in his tone lingered with her longer than she wanted to admit. She turned away first, walking back toward the house without another word, leaving Damien standing alone beneath the darkening sky, replaying the strange warmth of her hand in his, unable to explain why the memory refused to fade. That night, as the newlyweds prepared to travel to Damien's estate where Elena would now live, both of them sat in careful silence during the car ride, each staring out their respective windows, lost in private thoughts neither wished to share. Elena thought of her father's cold determination, her brother's quiet warnings, and the strange sensation that had passed through her hand during the ceremony. Damien thought of his grandfather's dying request, his father's simmering anger, and the unexpected pull he had felt every time Elena's eyes met his own. Neither of them spoke during the remainder of the drive, but as the car pulled through the gates of the Cross estate, both of them silently wondered the same unspoken question: whether this cold, arranged beginning was truly the end of the story, or only the very beginning of something far larger than either of them yet understood. Earlier that afternoon, before the ceremony had even begun, an incident had unfolded that neither Damien nor Elena would learn about until much later. Behind the main house, near the tents where caterers prepared the reception meal, a distant cousin of the Voss family named Priscilla had cornered a member of the Cross household staff, demanding answers about the wedding arrangements with obvious hostility. "Do not think for one moment that this marriage changes anything," Priscilla hissed at the young waiter, who had done nothing except carry a tray of glasses past her. "Your employers destroyed my family's business 30 years ago. I do not care how many rings get exchanged today. That debt runs deeper than any ceremony can fix." The young waiter, uncomfortable and unsure how to respond, simply nodded and hurried away, leaving Priscilla standing alone with her arms crossed, glaring toward the garden where preparations continued. Her bitterness was shared quietly by several older relatives on both sides, though most kept their opinions private, out of respect for the fragile peace both fathers had insisted upon for the day. Not everyone honored that request. During the reception, an elderly uncle from the Cross side, a stern man named Walter, approached Victor Voss directly, ignoring the careful distance the seating arrangements had been designed to maintain. "I remember your father well," Walter said coldly, holding his glass without drinking from it. "A dishonest man who tried to cheat his way into markets that were never his to claim." Victor's expression hardened instantly. "My father built an honest business from nothing, and your family tore it apart out of greed. Do not stand here and rewrite history simply because the wine has loosened your tongue." The two men stared each other down for a tense moment before a nearby relative intervened, gently guiding Walter away before the confrontation could escalate further. Victor stood alone afterward, his hands trembling slightly with restrained anger, forcing himself to breathe evenly before returning to his seat near the front of the reception. These small, bitter exchanges continued throughout the evening, hidden mostly from Damien and Elena themselves, who remained occupied with the exhausting performance of appearing united for their guests. Yet the undercurrent of old hostility ran through every corner of the celebration, a quiet reminder that no single wedding, however carefully arranged, could erase 40 years of accumulated resentment overnight. As the newlyweds' car finally disappeared down the long driveway toward Damien's estate, Victor Voss stood on the edge of the now empty garden, watching the taillights fade into the darkness. Owen approached his father quietly, standing beside him without speaking for a long moment. "Do you truly believe this will fix everything you lost?" Owen asked finally, his voice carefully neutral. Victor did not answer immediately. "I believe it is the only chance we have," he said at last. "Whether it succeeds depends on factors none of us can fully control." "And Elena," Owen pressed. "Have you considered what this costs her?" Victor's shoulders tensed slightly, though he did not turn to face his son. "I have considered it every single day since I made this decision. But some sacrifices, however painful, are necessary for the survival of a family. I hope one day she understands that." Owen said nothing further, though his expression made clear he did not fully share his father's certainty. The two men stood together in silence as the last guests departed, the empty garden growing quiet around them, filled only with the lingering scent of crushed flowers, and the fading echoes of a celebration that had never truly felt like one. Meanwhile, at the Cross estate, Gerald stood alone in his study long after the wedding had ended, staring out the window toward the driveway where his son's car would soon arrive. His expression remained hard and unreadable, his thoughts occupied with calculations that had nothing to do with sentiment or reconciliation. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts, and his longtime advisor, a sharp-eyed man named Franklin, stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind him. "The arrangements are complete," Franklin said quietly, "just as you instructed." Gerald nodded slowly, still staring out the window. "Good. Whatever sentimental promises my father extracted from Damien before he died, I intend to make certain this marriage serves this family's interests, not the Voss family's recovery." Franklin hesitated before speaking again. "And if Damien begins to develop genuine feelings for her?" "Marriages built on proximity sometimes shift in unexpected directions." Gerald turned from the window, his expression cold and final. "Then we will simply have to remind him where his loyalty truly belongs. This family did not survive for generations by allowing sentiment to interfere with strategy. Whatever affection may or may not grow between them, it changes nothing about what needs to happen next." Franklin nodded silently, understanding the unspoken instructions carried within his employer's words, before quietly leaving the room. Gerald remained standing by the window a while longer, his mind already turning toward plans that neither his son nor his new daughter-in-law yet suspected existed. Plans that would soon test the fragile new beginning neither of them had wanted, but both would eventually be forced to fight for. The first crash echoed through the hallway before dawn, jolting Elena awake in an unfamiliar bed inside an unfamiliar house. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding, momentarily forgetting where she was until the cold silence of the room reminded her. She was no longer in her father's house. She was a married woman now, living inside the Cross estate, surrounded by people who barely acknowledged her presence. She rose quietly and opened her bedroom door, following the sound down the hallway until she found a young housemaid kneeling on the floor, gathering shattered pieces of a porcelain vase with trembling hands. "I am so sorry, madam," the maid stammered, clearly frightened. "I did not mean to wake you. I will clean this immediately." Elena knelt beside her without hesitation, helping gather the broken pieces despite the maid's protests. "It is only a vase," she said gently. "No one was hurt. That is what matters." The maid stared at her with visible surprise, as though kindness was not something she expected from the new mistress of the house. "Thank you, madam," she whispered, before hurrying away with the broken pieces cradled carefully in a cloth. Elena remained kneeling on the cold floor a moment longer, staring at the empty hallway around her. The house was enormous, filled with expensive furniture and portraits of stern-faced ancestors staring down from the walls, yet it felt colder and emptier than anywhere she had ever lived. She missed her old room, her father's occasional gruff affection, even her brother's protective arguments. Here, she was simply a name attached to a marriage certificate, expected to occupy space quietly and cause no disruption. Breakfast that morning was another exercise in careful distance. Damien sat at one end of the long dining table, reading through paperwork on his tablet, while Elena sat at the opposite end, picking quietly at her food. A staff member refilled their coffee cups without a word, the silence between them stretching uncomfortably across the polished wood. "Did you sleep well?" Damien asked eventually, without looking up from his screen. "Well enough," Elena replied, equally distant. Silence returned, broken only by the occasional clink of silverware. Elena studied Damien from across the table, noting the tension in his shoulders, the tired shadows beneath his eyes. Whatever pressure his family placed upon him clearly weighed heavily, though he gave no indication of wanting to share it with her. "If you need anything," Damien said finally, closing his tablet, "the staff can assist you. I have meetings most of the day." "Of course," Elena replied simply, watching him rise from the table and leave without another word. Days passed in much the same pattern. Damien left early for business obligations, returning late in the evening, exhausted and withdrawn. Elena spent her hours exploring the vast estate, reading in the enormous library, or speaking quietly with staff members who slowly began warming to her presence, appreciating her politeness in a household accustomed to cold formality. One afternoon, while wandering through a section of the house she had not yet explored, Elena discovered a locked door at the end of a narrow hallway. Curious, she asked one of the older maids, a kind woman named Doris, about the room. "That was Master Edmund's private study," Doris explained quietly. "No one has entered it since he passed. Master Damien has not allowed anyone to touch it." Elena nodded, respecting the unspoken grief attached to the space, though her curiosity lingered. She thought of the grandfather she had never met, the man whose dying wish had shaped her entire future, and wondered what secrets that locked room might still hold. That evening, Damien returned home later than usual, visibly exhausted from a difficult negotiation, involving a business partner threatening to withdraw a major contract. He found Elena sitting alone in the library, a book resting unopened in her lap, staring absently out the window at the darkening garden below. "You are still awake," he said, surprised to find her there. "I could not sleep," Elena admitted. "This house is very quiet at night." Damien hesitated, then walked further into the room, sitting in the chair across from her rather than continuing toward his own quarters as he usually did. "Is it too quiet?" he asked, "or simply unfamiliar?" Elena considered the question carefully, both perhaps. "I am not used to a house this large, or this empty." Damien nodded slowly, understanding more than he expected to. "My grandfather used to say the same thing about this place after my grandmother passed. He said a house only feels alive when the people inside it choose to make it that way." Elena studied him curiously. "You do not speak of him often." "It is difficult," Damien admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "He shaped nearly everything about who I am, yet his final request placed both of us in this strange position we now find ourselves in." Elena remained silent for a moment, surprised by his sudden openness. "Do you regret honoring his wish?" Damien considered the question seriously before answering. "Some days, yes. Other days I remind myself that promises made to those we love rarely come without difficulty. I do not regret keeping my word. I only wish circumstances had allowed it to happen differently, for your sake as much as mine." Elena felt something shift slightly within her chest at his words, an unexpected warmth she quickly tried to suppress. She was not ready to trust kindness from across, no matter how genuine it appeared. "That is generous of you to consider," she said carefully, keeping her tone neutral, "though it changes little about our circumstances." Damien nodded, accepting her guarded response without pushing further. They sat together a while longer in comfortable silence, neither speaking, both simply present in the same space for the first time since their wedding, without the weight of performance between them. As the days continued, small moments like this began accumulating quietly between them. Damien found himself lingering longer at breakfast, asking Elena about her day rather than immediately retreating to work. Elena found herself waiting near the entrance in the evenings, curious to hear how his negotiations had unfolded, though she told herself it was simple politeness rather than genuine interest. One particular evening, while helping Damien search for missing documents in his study, their hands brushed accidentally as they both reached for the same folder. The same strange warmth from their wedding day passed instantly between them, sharp and unmistakable, causing both to pull back quickly, startled by the intensity of the sensation. "I am sorry," Elena said quickly, stepping back. "No, it is fine," Damien replied, though his voice sounded slightly unsteady. "That was unexpected." Neither of them spoke further about what had happened, both retreating into careful silence for the remainder of the evening, though the memory of that brief touch lingered persistently in both their minds long after they had separated for the night. Elena lay awake later that night, staring at the ceiling of her bedroom, replaying the sensation over and over, trying to understand why something so small had affected her so deeply. She told herself it meant nothing, simple static electricity or overactive nerves from stress, yet some quiet part of her refused to fully accept that explanation. Down the hallway, Damien sat alone in his own room, equally troubled by his inability to explain the strange, persistent pull he felt whenever Elena was near. He thought of his grandfather's old stories about fate and connection, stories he had always dismissed as sentimental nonsense from an older generation. Yet increasingly, he found himself wondering if there was more truth buried in those old tales than he had ever allowed himself to consider. Neither of them spoke of these feelings openly, both too guarded by pride, family loyalty, and the painful history binding their families together to admit that something unexpected was beginning to grow between them. Yet beneath the careful distance they both maintained, a quiet, undeniable current continued building, patient and persistent, waiting for the moment when neither of them would be able to deny it any longer. Meanwhile, unseen by either of them, Gerald Cross continued monitoring the situation carefully through quiet reports from household staff loyal to him rather than to his son. He listened attentively as Franklin described small changes in behavior, lingering conversations, brief moments of unexpected warmth passing between Damien and his new wife. "This is precisely what I feared," Gerald muttered after one such report, his expression darkening with quiet calculation. "Keep watching them closely, Franklin. If genuine affection begins taking root, we will need to intervene before it grows into something we can no longer control." Franklin nodded silently, understanding the weight of his employer's words, while across the city, inside the Voss household, Victor Voss received similar reports of his own from relatives who occasionally visited the Cross estate under the pretense of maintaining family courtesy. Victor listened carefully to each report, his expression unreadable, already turning over quiet calculations of his own, regarding what a genuine bond between Damien and Elena might mean for the plans he had built his family's recovery around. Whatever affection might be quietly growing between the two newlyweds, both fathers privately understood that it threatened to complicate carefully laid plans. Neither of them was willing to abandon so easily. A week later, Elena decided to visit her old home for the first time since the wedding, missing her brother, and wanting to check on her father despite their strained relationship. Damien offered to have a driver take her, but Elena insisted on going alone, needing the quiet drive to gather her thoughts before facing her family again. Owen greeted her warmly at the door, pulling her into a tight hug the moment she stepped inside. "You look tired," he said, studying her face carefully. "Is that house treating you well?" "It is complicated," Elena admitted, following him into the familiar living room she had grown up in. "The house is beautiful, but it does not feel like home yet. Perhaps it never will." "And Damien?" Owen asked carefully, watching his sister's expression closely. "How is he treating you?" Elena hesitated before answering, surprising herself with how difficult the question felt to answer honestly. "He has been kinder than I expected," she admitted quietly. "Kinder than I wanted him to be, if I am being truthful." Owen raised an eyebrow, catching something in her tone that Elena had not intended to reveal. "That sounds like more than simple politeness, Elena." "It is nothing," she said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "We share a house. Basic courtesy is unavoidable under those circumstances." Owen studied her for a long moment, clearly unconvinced, but chose not to press the matter further, sensing his sister was not yet ready to examine her own feelings too closely. Instead, he changed the subject, updating her on their father's ongoing efforts to rebuild the family business, using the renewed connections the marriage had created. Later that afternoon, Elena found her father alone in his study, surrounded by paperwork just as she remembered from before the wedding. He looked up when she entered, his expression softening slightly at the sight of her. "You look well," Victor said, setting his papers aside. "Marriage appears to suit you better than I expected it might." Elena sat across from him, choosing her words carefully. "It is still difficult, father, but I am managing." Victor nodded, studying his daughter with quiet attention. "And Damien? Is he treating you with the respect you deserve?" "He is," Elena said honestly, surprising herself again with how easily the admission came. "He has been thoughtful, in his own way, more than I expected from someone raised in that family." Victor's expression grew thoughtful, though he said nothing further on the subject, simply nodding slowly as though filing the information away for later consideration. Elena stayed a while longer, catching up on family news, before finally returning to the Cross estate as evening approached, her mind occupied with thoughts she was still not ready to fully acknowledge. When she returned, she found Damien waiting near the entrance, having finished his own obligations earlier than expected that day. He looked genuinely pleased to see her, though he tried to mask it with casual conversation. "How was your visit?" he asked, taking her light coat as she stepped inside. "It was good to see my brother again," Elena said, "and my father seemed different, calmer than before the wedding." Damien nodded thoughtfully. "I am glad. I know this transition has been difficult for you, leaving your family home behind." Elena studied him carefully, noting the genuine concern in his voice. "Thank you for understanding that," she said quietly. "Not everyone in your position would bother." Damien held her gaze a moment longer than necessary before responding. "Perhaps I am beginning to realize that this arrangement does not have to remain as cold as it started. Not unless we choose to let it stay that way." Elena felt her heart quicken slightly at his words, though she quickly reminded herself of every reason she had built to resist exactly this kind of unexpected warmth. Still, as she walked past him toward the staircase that evening, she could not shake the growing sense that whatever was quietly building between them had already grown too strong to easily ignore. A sudden scream from the kitchen sent Damien running before he even registered leaving his chair. He found one of the cooks clutching her hand, blood dripping from a deep cut caused by a slipped knife, panic spreading quickly among the staff around her. Elena arrived seconds later, pushing past him calmly and taking control of the situation with surprising steadiness, wrapping the wound tightly with a clean cloth while instructing another staff member to bring the first aid kit. "You did well," Damien said quietly afterward, once the cook had been safely taken to receive proper medical attention. "Most people panic in situations like that." "I grew up around minor emergencies," Elena replied simply. "My father was not always careful with his temper, and accidents happened often enough in our house that I learned how to stay calm." Damien studied her with quiet admiration, though he said nothing further, filing away yet another small detail about the woman he was slowly beginning to understand better each day. That evening, an unexpected guest arrived at the estate, a distant relative of Damien's grandmother named Margaret Ashcombe, who had known Edmund since childhood and maintained close ties to the family despite living several hours away. She was an elderly woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper memory, known throughout both families for her deep knowledge of their combined history. Margaret had come specifically to pay her respects following Edmund's passing, since she had been unable to attend the funeral due to illness at the time. Damien welcomed her warmly, inviting her to stay for dinner, and Elena joined them at the table, curious about this woman who seemed to carry decades of family history within her memory. Throughout dinner, Margaret shared stories about Edmund's younger years, painting a picture of a man far more complicated than either Damien or Elena had previously understood. She spoke of his early ambitions, his eventual guilt over the choices that led to the rift between the two families, and his lifelong hope that one day the wound might finally heal. "He always believed in old family connections," Margaret said, sipping her tea thoughtfully. "Not simply business ties or reconciliation through marriage contracts, but something deeper. He used to speak of certain families being bound together across generations by something beyond ordinary choice." Elena glanced curiously at Damien, who looked equally puzzled by the comment. "What do you mean by bound together?" Damien asked. Margaret smiled knowingly, setting down her teacup. "There are old stories, passed through generations in families like ours, about certain pairs of people who share an unusually strong connection from the moment they meet. Some call it destiny, others call it a deeper bond that exists regardless of family history or personal choice. Edmund believed your marriage might be exactly that kind of connection, though he never explained precisely why he believed it so strongly." Elena felt her pulse quicken slightly at the mention of an unusual bond, immediately thinking of the strange warmth she had felt during the wedding ceremony and again during their accidental touch in the study. She glanced at Damien and noticed his expression had shifted slightly, as though he too were recalling something similar. "That sounds like little more than an old family legend," Damien said carefully, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. Margaret studied him with knowing eyes. "Perhaps. Or perhaps Edmund recognized something in the two of you that neither of you have yet allowed yourselves to fully acknowledge." The conversation moved on to other topics after that, though both Damien and Elena remained quietly distracted for the remainder of the evening, each turning Margaret's words over carefully in their minds. After Margaret retired to her guest room for the night, Damien and Elena found themselves alone in the sitting room, an unusually charged silence settling between them. "Do you believe what she said?" Elena asked finally, breaking the silence. Damien hesitated before answering honestly. "I do not know what to believe, but I cannot deny that something unusual has been happening between us since the wedding. The warmth whenever we touch. The way certain moments feel heavier than they should. Elena nodded slowly, relieved to hear him acknowledge what she had been feeling too, though admitting it aloud made everything suddenly feel more real and more frightening. I have felt it too, she confessed quietly. I told myself it meant nothing. Static, or nerves, or simple imagination. And now, Damien asked gently. Now I am not certain what to think anymore, Elena admitted. They sat together in thoughtful silence, both quietly processing the strange possibility that their marriage, forced upon them through debt and duty, might be tied to something far larger than either of them had originally believed. Neither of them spoke of love, unwilling to rush toward conclusions neither felt ready to embrace, yet something had undeniably shifted between them that evening, a quiet acknowledgement that their connection was not simply the product of forced proximity. The following morning, Margaret requested a private conversation with Elena before departing back to her own home. The two women sat together in the garden, surrounded by blooming flowers, while Margaret studied Elena thoughtfully. I know this must all feel overwhelming, Margaret said gently. A forced marriage is difficult enough without the added complexity of an unusual bond neither of you asked for. It is overwhelming, Elena admitted. I do not know how to reconcile everything I was taught to believe about the Cross family with what I am beginning to feel for Damien. Margaret smiled kindly. Sometimes the deepest connections form in the most unlikely circumstances. It does not erase the pain your families have caused each other, but it also does not have to be defined entirely by that pain either. What you build together now is entirely up to the two of you. Elena considered her words carefully, grateful for the older woman's quiet wisdom. Thank you for telling us about Edmund's beliefs. I think we both needed to hear it, even if we are not yet certain what to do with the information. Margaret patted her hand gently before rising to leave. Take your time, my dear. Whatever this connection between you and Damien truly is, it will not disappear simply because you choose caution over certainty. These things tend to reveal themselves fully, given enough patience. After Margaret departed later that morning, Elena found herself replaying the conversation repeatedly throughout the day, unable to shake the growing certainty that something significant was unfolding within her marriage, something far beyond the simple business arrangement it had originally been designed to be. Meanwhile, Damien spent much of his day distracted during business meetings, his mind repeatedly drifting back to Margaret's words and the quiet conversation he had shared with Elena the previous evening. Lucas noticed his friend's distraction immediately during their afternoon meeting, and pulled him aside once the other attendees had left the room. You are somewhere else entirely today, Lucas observed. What happened? Damien hesitated before sharing Margaret's story about old family bonds and destined connections, watching Lucas's expression shift from skepticism to genuine curiosity as the explanation unfolded. You actually believe this? Lucas asked finally. I do not know what I believe, Damien admitted, but something has been happening between Elena and myself since the wedding that I cannot easily explain away. Perhaps Margaret's story provides an answer, perhaps it does not. Either way, I find myself unable to stop thinking about it. Lucas studied his friend carefully before responding. Then perhaps it is worth exploring honestly, rather than dismissing it simply because it complicates an already difficult situation. If there is truth to this bond, ignoring it will not make it disappear. It will only delay the moment you are forced to confront it directly. Damien considered his friend's advice carefully throughout the remainder of the day, and by the time evening arrived, he found himself seeking out Elena with a newfound sense of purpose, ready to explore honestly whatever strange connection continued growing steadily between them, regardless of where that honesty might eventually lead them both. He found her in the garden, sitting near the same flowers where she had spoken with Margaret earlier that morning, a book resting unopened in her lap while she watched the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon. He approached quietly, and she looked up, offering him a small, genuine smile that felt different from the guarded politeness she usually wore around him. I have been thinking about what Margaret said all day, Damien admitted, sitting beside her on the stone bench. So have I, Elena said. I do not know what frightens me more, the possibility that it is true, or the possibility that it is not, and I am simply inventing reasons to feel something for a man my family has spent decades teaching me to distrust. Damien turned to face her fully, choosing his next words with care. Perhaps it does not matter which explanation is correct. What matters is what we choose to do with whatever this is, whether fate placed it here, or whether it grew naturally between two people forced into difficult circumstances together. Elena studied him carefully, searching his expression for any trace of dishonesty and finding none. That sounds remarkably reasonable for a man raised inside a family built on decades of resentment. Perhaps I am tired of carrying resentment that was never truly mine to begin with, Damien replied quietly. My grandfather spent his final years consumed by guilt over choices he made long before I was born. I do not wish to spend my own life carrying anger over a conflict I never personally chose to be part of. Elena considered his words for a long moment, something shifting visibly behind her eyes. I have spent my entire life hearing about everything your family took from mine, she admitted. It has been difficult to separate you from that history, even when everything about your behavior suggests you are not the man that history led me to expect. And what do you see now? Damien asked gently. When you look at me honestly, separate from everything you were taught to believe? Elena hesitated, her voice softer than before. I see someone who has been kind to me, patient with my anger, and honest about his own uncertainty. I see someone who, despite everything, I find myself wanting to trust, even though trusting you frightens me more than I expected it would. Damien reached out slowly, taking her hand gently in his own, and the familiar warmth passed between them immediately, stronger now than it had ever felt before, spreading steadily up through both their arms like a current finally allowed to flow freely after being dammed for too long. I am frightened too, Damien admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, but I would rather face this uncertainty honestly with you than continue pretending it does not exist simply because our families demand that we remain enemies. Elena's fingers tightened around his, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply sitting together in the fading evening light, allowing themselves to fully acknowledge, for the very first time, that whatever force had brought them together, whether ancient bond or simple circumstance, it had grown into something neither of them wished to deny any longer. As darkness settled fully over the garden, they remained seated together, quietly building the first true foundation of trust either of them had allowed themselves to construct since the difficult beginning of their forced marriage, unaware that this fragile new understanding would soon be tested by forces neither of them yet anticipated. Later that night, Franklin delivered his usual report to Gerald, describing the scene he had observed through a study window overlooking the garden, the long conversation, the held hands, the unmistakable warmth passing between Damien and Elena as evening turned to night. Gerald listened in silence, his expression darkening steadily with each detail Franklin provided. When the report finished, he remained quiet for a long moment, staring into the fireplace before finally speaking. It seems Margaret's visit accomplished exactly what I feared it might, Gerald said quietly. Old stories about fate and destiny, filling my son's head with sentimental nonsense at precisely the wrong moment. Shall I arrange for her to be discouraged from future visits? Franklin asked carefully. Gerald considered the suggestion, then shook his head slowly. No, that would only draw suspicion. Instead, we will need a more careful approach. If Damien believes he has found something rare and irreplaceable in this marriage, then perhaps it is time he learns that even rare things can be made to seem worthless, given the right circumstances and the right doubts planted at the right moment. Franklin nodded, understanding the quiet instruction hidden within his employer's words, before excusing himself to begin considering exactly how such doubts might be carefully constructed and planted in the days ahead. Gerald remained alone in his study long afterward, staring into the flames, already turning over the early pieces of a plan that would soon threaten everything Damien and Elena had only just begun to build between them. Tires screeched loudly against wet pavement as Elena's car spun sideways without warning, the steering wheel jerking violently beneath her hands. Rain had been falling steadily all afternoon, and a delivery truck ahead of her had braked suddenly to avoid a fallen tree branch blocking part of the road. Elena swerved instinctively, but the wet surface offered no grip, and her small car slid directly toward the guardrail separating the road from a steep embankment below. She barely had time to scream before the car struck the rail hard, the impact jolting her body forward against the seatbelt, glass cracking across the windshield from the force of the collision. The car came to a stop at an awkward angle, half its frame hanging precariously over the edge of the embankment, the front tire spinning uselessly in the open air. Elena sat frozen, her hands trembling on the wheel, too stunned to move, aware that any sudden shift in weight might send the vehicle tumbling down the slope. Her phone had been thrown from the passenger seat during the crash, landing somewhere out of reach on the floor, its screen cracked but still glowing faintly. Meanwhile, across the city, Damien had been trying to reach her for nearly 20 minutes, growing increasingly anxious when his calls went unanswered. He had promised to meet her for a late lunch that afternoon, and Elena was never late without explanation. When Lucas noticed his growing agitation during a business call, he quietly suggested checking the traffic reports for the route Elena would have taken. The moment Damien saw the report describing a serious accident on the very road Elena traveled each week to visit her family, His blood ran cold. He abandoned the meeting immediately, ignoring Lucas's attempts to accompany him, and drove faster than he had ever driven in his life toward the reported location, his mind consumed entirely with fear for her safety. He arrived to find emergency vehicles already on the scene, their lights flashing against the gray, rain-soaked afternoon. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered nearby, kept back by a police officer directing traffic around the accident. Damien pushed past them without hesitation, his heart pounding painfully as he searched frantically for any sign of Elena. He spotted her car first, still balanced precariously over the embankment edge, rescue workers carefully securing straps around the vehicle to stabilize it before attempting extraction. Panic surged through him at the sight, and he shouted her name, ignoring the officer who tried to hold him back. "She is stable, sir," one of the paramedics called out, seeing his distress. "We are extracting her carefully right now. She is conscious and talking." Damien watched helplessly as the rescue team worked methodically, every second stretching unbearably long, until finally they managed to free the car door and gently guide Elena out, wrapping a blanket around her shaking shoulders as they helped her toward a waiting stretcher. Damien rushed forward the moment she was clear of the vehicle, kneeling beside the stretcher and taking her hand firmly in his own. "Elena," he said, his voice breaking with emotion he had never allowed himself to show so openly before. "I am here. You are safe now." Elena turned toward him, tears mixing with rain on her pale face, relief flooding through her at the sound of his voice. "Damien," she whispered weakly. "I have you," he said firmly, refusing to let go of her hand even as the paramedics prepared to load her into the ambulance. "I am not leaving your side." He climbed into the ambulance beside her despite the paramedics' initial hesitation, insisting firmly that he would not be separated from his wife during such a critical moment. Throughout the ride to the hospital, he remained close beside her, holding her hand tightly, offering quiet reassurance whenever her fear threatened to overwhelm her. At the hospital, doctors quickly assessed her condition, relieved to discover that despite the frightening appearance of the accident, Elena had suffered only minor injuries, a mild concussion, several bruises, and a small cut above her eyebrow that would require a few careful stitches. Still, the doctors insisted on keeping her overnight for observation, given the severity of the crash. Damien refused to leave the hospital, remaining in the uncomfortable chair beside her bed throughout the entire evening, watching over her carefully as she drifted in and out of exhausted sleep. When she woke briefly in the early hours of the morning, she found him still seated beside her, his hand wrapped gently around hers, his eyes red from lack of sleep and unmasked worry. "You should rest," Elena murmured groggily, noticing his exhausted state. "I could not rest, knowing you were in danger," Damien admitted quietly. "When I could not reach you, and then heard about the accident, I have never felt fear like that in my entire life." Elena studied his face carefully in the dim hospital light, moved deeply by the raw honesty in his expression, an honesty that erased any lingering doubt she still carried about the sincerity of his feelings toward her. "I was frightened too," she admitted softly, "but hearing your voice when they pulled me from the car, it was the first thing that made me feel safe again." Damien squeezed her hand gently, his voice thick with emotion. "I do not know what I would have done if something worse had happened to you today, Elena. In that moment, waiting to know if you were safe, I understood something I had been avoiding admitting to myself since the day we married." "What is that?" Elena asked quietly, though something in his tone told her she already knew the answer before he spoke it aloud. "I love you," Damien said simply, the words carrying a weight and certainty that surprised even himself as he spoke them. "Whatever this connection between us truly is, fate or simple chance, I know now without any doubt that my feelings for you are entirely real, and I am no longer willing to pretend otherwise." Tears filled Elena's eyes, though this time they were not born from fear or pain, but from the overwhelming relief of finally hearing spoken aloud the very feelings she had been quietly nursing within herself for weeks, uncertain whether she had permission to feel them at all. "I love you too," Elena whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I have felt it building for some time now, though I was too frightened to admit it, even to myself, given everything our families have taught us to believe about each other." Damien leaned forward carefully, pressing a gentle kiss against her forehead, mindful of her injuries, yet unable to resist expressing the depth of relief and love flooding through him in that quiet hospital room. "We will figure out how to make this work," Damien said firmly. "Whatever obstacles our families place before us, whatever old grievances stand between our names, I refuse to let any of it take this away from us now that I finally understand what we truly have." Elena smiled weakly through her exhaustion, gripping his hand tightly. "Together," she said softly. "Together," Damien echoed, And for the first time since their forced marriage began, both of them finally allowed themselves to fully embrace the powerful, undeniable connection that had been growing steadily between them since the very moment their hands first touched during their wedding ceremony. The following morning, Elena was released from the hospital with instructions to rest for several days, and Damien insisted on personally driving her home, refusing to allow anyone else to attend to her needs during her recovery. As they settled into the car for the quiet drive back to the estate, Elena rested her head gently against his shoulder, and Damien wrapped his arm carefully around her, both of them finally at peace with the truth they had spent weeks trying desperately to avoid. Neither of them yet knew that this newfound happiness, so hard-won through fear and near tragedy, was about to face its greatest challenge yet, as forces working quietly behind the scenes prepared to test the strength of the bond they had only just begun to fully claim as their own. News of the accident traveled quickly, and by that afternoon, Owen arrived at the Cross estate with barely contained worry etched across his face, having heard second-hand reports that exaggerated the severity of his sister's condition. Elena met him in the sitting room, a small bandage above her eyebrow the only visible sign of what she had endured the previous day. "You look better than I feared," Owen said, pulling her into a careful hug. "Father wanted to come himself, but he had an urgent meeting he could not postpone. He asked me to check on you and report back immediately." "Tell him I am fine," Elena said gently. "Bruised, tired, but fine. Damien has taken excellent care of me since it happened." Owen studied her closely, noticing something different in the way she spoke Damien's name, a warmth that had not been present during her previous visits home. "Something has changed since I last saw you," he observed carefully. Elena hesitated, then decided honesty was overdue. "Yes," she admitted. "I have fallen in love with him, Owen. I did not expect it, and I fought against it longer than I probably should have, but it is true, and yesterday made me realize just how deeply true it has become." Owen sat back, processing this information slowly. "After everything our family has said about the Cross name," he said finally, "after everything Father built this marriage around achieving strategically, you are telling me you have genuinely fallen for him." "I know how it sounds," Elena said, "but Owen, he is not our father's enemy. He is not Gerald Cross, carrying decades of resentment forward like a weapon. He is simply a man who was placed into an impossible situation, just as I was, and somehow, despite everything working against us, we found something real together." Owen studied his sister carefully, searching for any sign of naivety in her expression, but finding instead a quiet certainty that surprised him. "Then I am happy for you," he said finally, though caution still colored his tone. "Just be careful, Elena. Gerald Cross has never struck me as a man who accepts things simply because his son wishes them to be true. If he learns how deeply this connection has grown, I fear he may not welcome it as warmly as you deserve." Elena nodded slowly, aware that her brother's warning carried real weight. "I know," she admitted quietly, "but I refuse to let fear of what Gerald might do keep me from embracing what I have found with Damien. We have already faced so much simply to reach this point. I am not willing to retreat now." Owen squeezed her hand supportively before rising to leave, promising to relay a gentler version of events back to their father, though privately he remained concerned about how Victor might react to news of his daughter's genuine affection for a Cross, given how carefully his father had constructed this marriage, purely around strategic recovery, rather than emotional connection. That evening, once Owen had departed, Damien found Elena resting quietly in the library, and he settled beside her, gently checking the bandage above her eyebrow with careful attention. "Owen seemed relieved to see you recovering so well," Damien observed. "He was," Elena confirmed. "I told him about us, about how I truly feel." Damien's expression grew curious. "And how did he respond?" "He was surprised," Elena admitted, "but supportive, in his own cautious way. Though he did warn me that your father may not react as kindly once he learns how serious this has become between us." Damien's expression darkened slightly at the mention of his father, though he tried not to let his concern show too openly. "My father has never been a man easily moved by sentiment," he admitted. "But I do not intend to let his opinions dictate what I choose to build with you. Whatever concerns he may raise, we will face them together, exactly as we promised each other in that hospital room." Elena leaned into him gently, comforted by the quiet strength in his voice. "Together," she repeated softly. "Together," Damien agreed, wrapping his arm protectively around her as they sat quietly in the fading evening light, both still unaware of exactly how soon that promise would be tested by the very forces Owen had gently warned them to be wary of. Glass shattered against the study wall as Gerald hurled a heavy crystal tumbler across the room, the sound echoing violently through the quiet hallway outside. Damien had just informed his father, calmly and directly, that his feelings for Elena were genuine, that he intended to build a real marriage with her regardless of the old feud separating their families. Gerald's reaction had been immediate and explosive. "You cannot be serious," Gerald said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "After everything I warned you about, after everything that family has done to us, you stand here telling me you have fallen in love with Victor Voss's daughter?" "I am not asking for your approval," Damien said firmly, refusing to back down despite his father's anger. "I am simply telling you the truth. Elena is not the enemy you have spent decades convincing yourself she must be. She is kind, honest, and she makes me happier than I ever expected to feel within this marriage." Gerald's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Happiness was never the point of this arrangement, Damien. This marriage existed to close an old wound, nothing more. If you allow sentiment to cloud your judgment now, you risk undoing everything your grandfather sacrificed to arrange." "Grandfather wanted healing between our families," Damien countered. "Not simply a paper agreement designed to look convincing from the outside while resentment continues festering underneath. If Elena and I can build something genuine together, that is exactly the kind of healing he hoped for." Gerald studied his son for a long moment, his expression unreadable beneath simmering anger. Then he turned away, staring silently out the window, his shoulders rigid with restrained tension. "You may believe whatever comforts you, Damien," Gerald said finally, his voice quieter now, though no less cold. "But do not expect me to celebrate a bond built with the daughter of the man who nearly destroyed everything this family stands for. Whatever happiness you believe you have found, tread carefully. Sentiment has a way of blinding people to threats they refuse to see clearly." Damien left his father's study that evening, feeling unsettled despite his firm conviction, his father's warning lingering uncomfortably in his mind even as he tried to dismiss it. He found Elena waiting for him in their bedroom, her expression concerned the moment she saw his troubled face. "How did he take it?" Elena asked gently. "About as well as I expected," Damien admitted, sitting heavily on the edge of the bed. "He remains convinced this connection between us threatens everything our families have built. I do not think he will ever fully accept it, but I refuse to let his disapproval change what I know to be true about my feelings for you." Elena moved closer, taking his hand gently in her own. "I do not need his approval, Damien. I only need to know that you remain certain about what we have built together, regardless of what challenges arise around us." "I am certain," Damien said firmly, meeting her eyes with unwavering conviction. "Nothing my father says will change how I feel about you." Despite his reassurance, the following days brought a quiet, persistent tension into the household. Gerald grew increasingly withdrawn, spending long hours locked away in his study, occasionally exchanging hushed conversations with Franklin that neither Damien nor Elena were invited to witness. Though Gerald outwardly maintained cold civility toward Elena during shared meals, an unmistakable chill lingered beneath his careful politeness. Elena tried her best to remain patient, understanding that Gerald's resistance stemmed from decades of ingrained resentment that would not dissolve overnight, regardless of how genuine her feelings for Damien had become. Still, the constant undercurrent of disapproval weighed on her more heavily than she wanted to admit, especially during quiet moments when Damien was occupied with business obligations, and she found herself alone within the vast, still unfamiliar estate. One afternoon, while walking through the garden to clear her thoughts, Elena encountered Gerald unexpectedly near the same stone bench where she had first admitted her feelings to Damien weeks earlier. Gerald regarded her coolly as she approached, neither retreating nor offering any warmth in his expression. "Mrs. Cross," Gerald said evenly, using her married name with a formality that felt more distancing than respectful. "I trust you are settling comfortably into your new life here." "I am," Elena replied carefully, unwilling to be intimidated despite the tension radiating from him. "Though I sense that comfort is not something you particularly wish for me within this household." Gerald studied her for a long moment, something calculating flickering behind his eyes. "I wish for nothing more than the preservation of what my family has built across generations," he said finally. "Whatever feelings you and my son believe you share, I would advise caution. Emotions built quickly under unusual circumstances do not always withstand the pressures of reality once the novelty fades." Elena held his gaze steadily, refusing to let his words unsettle her outward composure, though privately his tone left her feeling uneasy. "I understand your concerns," she said evenly, "but I do not intend to let doubt planted by others determine what Damien and I know to be true about our own feelings." Gerald offered a thin, humorless smile. "We shall see, Mrs. Cross," he said quietly, before turning and walking back toward the house. leaving Elena standing alone in the garden with an unsettling chill creeping steadily through her despite the warm afternoon sun overhead. That evening, Elena mentioned the encounter to Damien, who grew visibly concerned upon hearing his father's carefully veiled warning. "I do not like the way he spoke to you," Damien said, his jaw tightening. "I will speak with him again." "It will not help," Elena said gently. "Your father has made his position clear. I do not think further arguments will change his mind. I only hope he does not attempt anything that might genuinely threaten what we have built together." Damien pulled her close, pressing a reassuring kiss against her forehead. "Whatever he attempts, we face it together, exactly as we promised each other. I will not allow his resentment to poison what we have found." Despite his reassurance, an uneasy feeling lingered between them for the remainder of that evening, both privately aware that Gerald's quiet, calculated resistance felt far more dangerous than any open confrontation might have been. Neither of them could have predicted just how far Gerald was already prepared to go in order to protect what he believed was his family's rightful legacy, nor how soon his carefully constructed plans would begin unfolding around them, threatening to unravel everything they had worked so hard to build together, since that frightening day beside the wrecked car on the rain-soaked road. Elsewhere in the city, Franklin met privately with a woman named Cordelia, an old acquaintance of the Voss family who had long harbored quiet resentment toward Victor for reasons of her own, having lost a significant business partnership years earlier due to decisions Victor had made during his family's original financial collapse. Franklin had approached her carefully over the previous week, offering financial incentive in exchange for her cooperation in a plan Gerald had carefully devised to test, and ultimately fracture, the growing bond between Damien and Elena. Cordelia listened carefully as Franklin outlined exactly what would be required of her, nodding slowly as the details became clear. "This will not be difficult," she said finally, a calculating gleam entering her eyes. Elena Voss has always been trusting to a fault. Convincing her that her husband's affection is nothing more than a calculated performance should not prove challenging at all, given the right approach and sufficiently convincing evidence. Franklin nodded, satisfied with her confidence, before providing her with the final details of Gerald's carefully constructed plan, a plan designed specifically to exploit the fragile trust Damien and Elena had only just begun building, threatening to shatter it completely before either of them fully understood what was happening around them. Back at the estate, unaware of the quiet scheme forming against them, Damien and Elena spent the following weekend attempting to build a small sense of normalcy within their marriage, away from the watchful, disapproving presence of Gerald. They took a short trip together to a quiet lake house owned by the Cross family, a property Damien had not visited since childhood, hoping the change of scenery might offer them both a brief reprieve from the mounting tension at home. The lake house was modest, compared to the grand estate they usually occupied, surrounded by tall pine trees and overlooking calm water that reflected the soft afternoon light. Elena walked along the wooden dock extending out over the lake, breathing in the fresh air with visible relief. "This feels like the first time I have truly relaxed since our wedding," she admitted, turning to look at Damien with a genuine smile. Damien joined her on the dock, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders. "I used to come here often as a child, before my grandmother passed away. It was the one place my family seemed to forget their constant need for status and appearances." Elena leaned into him, watching the gentle ripples move across the water's surface. "I wish we could stay here permanently, away from your father's disapproval and my own family's expectations. Perhaps one day we will build something like that for ourselves," Damien said quietly. "A life defined by what we choose, rather than what our families demand of us." Elena turned to face him fully, studying his expression carefully. "Do you truly believe that is possible, given everything working against us?" "I have to believe it," Damien said firmly. "Because the alternative, accepting that our happiness must always remain secondary to old grudges and family pride, is not a future I am willing to accept." They spent the remainder of the weekend enjoying quiet, uninterrupted moments together, cooking simple meals in the small kitchen, walking along wooded trails surrounding the property, and sitting together on the porch each evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. For the first time since their wedding, both of them allowed themselves to imagine a future built entirely on their own terms, free from the weight of decades-old resentment. Yet even as they enjoyed this brief escape, Franklin continued advancing Gerald's plan back in the city, meeting again with Cordelia, to finalize the specific details of how she would approach Elena once the couple returned from their trip. Cordelia had already begun crafting a convincing story, one designed carefully to plant seeds of doubt regarding Damien's true motivations, suggesting that his sudden affection had been calculated from the very beginning, as a means of controlling the Voss family's remaining assets through emotional manipulation rather than genuine love. She has vulnerabilities we can exploit, Cordelia explained to Franklin during their final meeting before the couple's return. Elena has spent her entire life doubting her own worth, always living in the shadow of her father's ambitions and her family's diminished status. If I can convince her that Damien views her similarly, simply as another asset to be managed rather than someone genuinely loved, the doubt will take root quickly. Franklin nodded approvingly, pleased with the careful precision of her approach. Gerald will be satisfied with this plan, he said. Proceed as soon as they return. The sooner doubt begins spreading, the sooner we can ensure this marriage returns to serving its original strategic purpose, rather than becoming a genuine partnership neither family intended to create. As Damien and Elena drove back toward the city late Sunday evening, neither of them suspected the storm quietly gathering ahead of them, nor how quickly the peaceful foundation they had just spent a weekend carefully strengthening was about to be tested by lies crafted specifically to exploit the deepest insecurities Elena had carried with her since childhood. A sharp knock at the door startled Elena from her reading Monday afternoon, and when she opened it, she found an unfamiliar woman standing on the doorstep, dressed elegantly and smiling with practiced warmth that did not quite reach her eyes. "I am sorry to intrude," the woman said smoothly. "My name is Cordelia. I used to work closely with your father years ago, before certain unfortunate events changed both our circumstances. I heard about your marriage and wanted to personally offer my congratulations, along with a small piece of advice from someone who has known this family far longer than you have." Elena, cautious but curious, invited the woman inside, offering her tea while they sat together in the sitting room. Cordelia spoke pleasantly at first, sharing carefully selected memories about the Voss family's earlier years, memories designed specifically to earn Elena's trust before she began steering the conversation toward its true purpose. "I imagine adjusting to life here has not been easy," Cordelia said sympathetically, "especially given how the Cross family has always operated. Gerald in particular has quite a reputation for strategic thinking, even when it comes to matters most people would consider personal." Elena's curiosity sharpened slightly. "What do you mean by that?" Cordelia hesitated deliberately, as though reluctant to share difficult information. "I only mention it because I care about your well-being, given my history with your family," she said carefully. "There have been whispers, among certain circles, that once did business with the Cross family, suggesting Damien's sudden affection toward you was carefully orchestrated from the very beginning. Apparently, Gerald believed that if Damien could convince you of genuine feelings, it would secure your family's remaining assets and loyalty, far more effectively than a simple business arrangement ever could." Elena felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. "That cannot be true," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "I understand this is difficult to hear," Cordelia continued gently, her tone carefully calibrated to sound sympathetic rather than accusatory. "But I have seen firsthand how calculating this family can be. Damien was raised by a father who taught him that emotions are simply tools to be used strategically. I would hate for you to be hurt further, discovering the truth only after you have given your heart completely." Elena sat in stunned silence, her mind racing back through every tender moment she had shared with Damien, searching desperately for any hint of dishonesty she might have previously overlooked. Cordelia, watching her carefully, pressed the doubt further with practiced precision. "I do not say this to hurt you," Cordelia added softly. "I say it because I wish someone had warned me before I trusted this family with something precious of my own, years ago. Trust me when I say that Gerald Cross does nothing without calculated purpose, and it would be foolish to assume his son operates any differently, regardless of how genuine his affection may currently appear." After Cordelia left, promising to check in again soon, Elena remained seated in the sitting room for a long time, her thoughts spiraling painfully as she replayed every interaction with Damien through this newly poisoned lens. The warmth during their wedding, his concern during her accident, his declaration of love in the hospital room, all of it now felt uncertain, tainted by the possibility that it had been nothing more than a carefully executed performance. When Damien returned home that evening, he immediately sensed something had shifted in Elena's demeanor. She greeted him with unusual coldness, avoiding his eyes as she moved quietly around the kitchen preparing dinner. "Is something wrong?" Damien asked, concern evident in his voice. "I am fine," Elena replied stiffly, though her tone suggested otherwise. Damien studied her carefully, unconvinced by her dismissive response. "Elena, please, if something is troubling you, I would rather know than watch you retreat behind walls again." Elena hesitated, torn between confronting him directly and avoiding a confrontation she was not yet prepared to face. Finally, she asked carefully, choosing her words with deliberate caution, Did your father ever suggest that you pursue a genuine emotional connection with me, specifically to secure my family's remaining loyalty and assets? Damien's expression shifted immediately to confusion, then concern. Where is this coming from, Elena? My father has made his disapproval of our relationship abundantly clear from the very beginning. He has never once suggested I should manufacture feelings toward you for strategic purposes. Are you certain? Elena pressed, her voice trembling slightly despite her attempt at composure. Because I received information today suggesting otherwise. Information from someone who claims to know your family's history far better than I do. Damien's frustration mixed visibly with hurt. Who told you this, Elena? Whatever they said, it is not true. My feelings for you were never calculated or planned. If anything, my father has actively opposed our relationship precisely because it threatens the strategic outcome he originally intended for this marriage. Elena wanted desperately to believe him, yet Cordelia's carefully planted doubt had already taken firm root within her, amplified by years of insecurity regarding her own worth beyond her family's strategic value. I want to believe you, she admitted quietly. But how can I be certain, Damien? How can I know for certain that everything we have shared has been genuine, rather than simply another carefully executed piece of your family's larger strategy? Damien stepped closer, taking her hands gently despite her initial resistance. Elena, look at me, he said firmly. I nearly lost you during that accident. The fear I felt in that moment was not calculated or planned. It was the most genuine emotion I have ever experienced in my entire life. Whatever someone told you today, they are lying, and I need you to trust me enough to believe that. Elena studied his face carefully, searching desperately for reassurance, yet the seed of doubt Cordelia had planted refused to fully dissolve, no matter how sincerely Damien pleaded his case. I need time, Elena said finally, pulling her hands away gently. I need time to think through everything clearly, without emotion clouding my judgment further. Damien watched helplessly as Elena retreated to their bedroom alone that evening, leaving him standing in the empty kitchen, confused and hurt by the sudden distance that had opened between them without warning. He had no way of knowing about Cordelia's visit, nor the carefully constructed lies his own father had orchestrated specifically to drive this exact wedge between them. That night, Elena lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, torn between the overwhelming certainty she had felt in Damien's arms just days earlier at the lake house, and the persistent gnawing doubt now poisoning every memory she tried to revisit. She thought of her father's original warning about the Cross family's calculating nature, of Owen's cautious concern about Gerald's likely reaction to their genuine happiness, and found herself increasingly uncertain about what to believe. Meanwhile, in his own study downstairs, Damien sat alone, equally troubled, replaying Elena's questions over and over, desperately trying to understand where such damaging accusations could have originated. He resolved to discover the truth the following morning, unaware that the very foundation of trust he and Elena had worked so hard to build was already beginning to crumble beneath the weight of his own father's carefully orchestrated betrayal. The following morning, Damien called Lucas early, asking him to meet urgently at a small cafe near the office rather than discussing the matter at the estate, where he feared certain conversations might not remain private. Lucas arrived to find his friend visibly exhausted, dark circles under his eyes betraying a sleepless night. Elena believes I orchestrated our entire relationship as some kind of calculated strategy, Damien explained, his voice tight with frustration. Someone convinced her that my father designed our romance specifically to secure the Voss family's remaining loyalty and assets. Lucas frowned deeply, considering the accusation carefully. Who would have told her something like that? I do not know, Damien admitted. But it has to be connected to my father somehow. He has made his disapproval of our relationship clear from the start. Yet suddenly someone approaches Elena directly with a story that conveniently serves his original strategic interests for this marriage. Lucas leaned back thoughtfully. If Gerald orchestrated this, he would not act carelessly. He would use someone unconnected to the family directly, someone Elena might trust or at least find credible, while maintaining enough distance to avoid suspicion falling directly on him. Damien's jaw tightened as the pieces began falling into place. Franklin, he said quietly, my father's advisor has been unusually active lately, meeting with people outside our usual business circles. I noticed it weeks ago but assumed it was simply routine business matters. Perhaps it is time you paid closer attention to exactly who Franklin has been meeting with, Lucas suggested carefully. If your father is behind this, exposing his involvement directly may be the only way to fully restore Elena's trust in you. Damien nodded grimly, already formulating a plan to investigate quietly, rather than confronting his father directly. understanding that accusations without solid proof would likely be dismissed or denied outright, potentially damaging his relationship with Elena even further in the process. Meanwhile, back at the estate, Elena sought comfort from Nora, who arrived that morning to check on her friend after sensing something troubling in Elena's brief phone call the previous night. Elena explained everything that had happened: Cordelia's visit, the doubts now plaguing her, and Damien's passionate denial the previous evening. Nora listened carefully throughout the entire explanation, her expression growing increasingly skeptical as Elena described the encounter with Cordelia in detail. "Something about this feels wrong," Nora said finally. "Think carefully, Elena. Have you ever met this woman before? Does anyone in your family actually remember her working closely with your father, as she claimed?" Elena paused, realizing she had never actually verified Cordelia's claims independently, having simply accepted her story based on the confident, sympathetic manner in which it had been delivered. "I do not know," she admitted slowly. "I never thought to question it. She seemed so certain, so genuinely concerned for my well-being." "That is precisely how effective manipulation often works," Nora said gently. "The most convincing lies rarely announce themselves as lies. They come wrapped in concern, delivered by someone who seems to have your best interests at heart. Before you allow this woman's claims to destroy what you and Damien have built together, perhaps you should investigate her story more carefully, rather than accepting it at face value simply because it arrived convincingly packaged." Elena considered her friend's advice seriously, doubt beginning to creep into her doubt itself, wondering now whether she had reacted too hastily the previous evening, allowing a stranger's unverified claims to overshadow weeks of genuine connection she had built carefully with Damien. "Perhaps you are right," Elena admitted quietly. "I need to speak with Damien again, honestly this time, rather than retreating behind suspicion before giving him a fair chance to address these accusations directly." As Elena resolved to confront the situation more carefully, unaware that Damien was simultaneously working to uncover the very truth she sought, neither of them yet realized how close they were to discovering the real source of the lies threatening to unravel everything they had worked so hard to build, nor how much pain still awaited them before that truth would finally come fully into the light. A folder slammed onto the desk startled Franklin from his morning coffee, and he looked up to find Damien standing over him, his expression cold and demanding. Damien had spent the previous 2 days quietly investigating Franklin's recent movements, discovering through a trusted contact within the household staff that Franklin had met privately with an unfamiliar woman on 3 separate occasions over the past month, always at locations far from the estate. "Who is Cordelia?" Damien demanded, his voice low and controlled despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "And why have you been meeting with her secretly for weeks?" Franklin's composure faltered visibly for just a moment, before he attempted to recover his usual professional demeanor. "I am not certain what you mean, sir," he said carefully. "I meet with many contacts as part of my regular duties." "Do not insult me with false denials," Damien said sharply. "I know she visited my wife directly, spreading lies designed to convince her that our relationship was nothing more than a calculated strategy orchestrated by my father. I want to know exactly how deeply you are involved in this, and I want the truth immediately." Franklin remained silent for a long moment, clearly weighing his loyalty to Gerald against the mounting evidence Damien had already gathered. Finally, recognizing that further denial would only damage his own position further, he exhaled slowly and began speaking. "Your father asked me to arrange it," Franklin admitted quietly. "He believed your growing attachment to Elena threatened the strategic value of this marriage. He wanted her to doubt your intentions, to create enough distance between the two of you that the relationship would return to serving its original purpose, rather than developing into something he considers dangerously sentimental." Damien felt a cold fury settle over him, confirming what he had already begun to suspect but had hoped desperately would prove untrue. "My own father orchestrated lies specifically designed to hurt the woman I love," he said quietly, his voice trembling with restrained anger. Franklin lowered his eyes, unable to meet Damien's furious gaze. "He believed he was protecting the family's interests," Franklin said, though his voice carried little conviction. "He was protecting nothing except his own outdated obsession with control," Damien said sharply, before turning and walking directly toward his father's study without another word to Franklin, who remained seated at his desk, visibly shaken by the confrontation. Damien found Gerald exactly where he expected, seated behind his desk reviewing business documents with characteristic calm composure. Gerald looked up as his son entered, immediately sensing the barely contained fury radiating from him. "I know what you did," Damien said, his voice shaking with anger he no longer attempted to control. "I know about Cordelia. about the lies you orchestrated to convince Elena that our entire relationship was nothing more than a calculated performance. Gerald's expression remained carefully composed, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes, confirming the truth of Damien's accusation, without requiring further explanation. I did what was necessary to protect this family's interests, Gerald said finally, his voice steady despite the confrontation. You did what was necessary to destroy the only genuine happiness I have found in years, Damien said furiously. Do you have any understanding of how deeply your manipulation has hurt her? How close you came to destroying something real simply because it did not align perfectly with your rigid strategic vision? Gerald rose slowly from his chair, meeting his son's anger with unwavering coldness. This marriage was never meant to become a genuine romance, Damien. It existed to close an old debt and restore stability between two families whose history has been defined by conflict for decades. I will not apologize for taking steps to ensure that original purpose remains intact. You will not apologize, Damien repeated incredulously. Even now, knowing the pain you have caused, you still refuse to acknowledge that what Elena and I share is real? Real feelings do not change strategic realities, Gerald said coldly. If your affection for her is as genuine as you claim, it will survive this test. If it cannot survive a few carefully placed doubts, then perhaps it was never as strong as you believed it to be in the first place. Damien stared at his father, stunned by the calculated coldness of his justification, finally understanding fully the depth of manipulation his father was willing to employ, even against his own son's happiness, in service of preserving whatever rigid vision of family legacy he had constructed in his mind decades earlier. I will not allow you to interfere in my marriage again, Damien said firmly, his voice regaining steady control despite the anger still coursing through him. Whatever authority you believe you hold over this family's affairs, it does not extend to manipulating my wife's trust in me. If you attempt anything like this again, I will not hesitate to distance myself entirely from this family's business interests, regardless of the consequences that decision might carry. Gerald studied his son carefully, recognizing the unwavering resolve in his voice, though his own expression remained largely unreadable. We shall see how committed you remain once reality settles fully upon this marriage, Gerald said quietly, before turning back to his desk, effectively ending the conversation. Damien left the study consumed with anger and heartbreak, understanding now precisely how much damage his father's manipulation had already caused, and uncertain whether he could repair the trust that had been so carefully poisoned before he had even discovered the source of the betrayal. He found Elena waiting for him in the library that evening, her expression cautious but no longer entirely closed off, having spent the previous day reconsidering Cordelia's claims following her conversation with Nora. When Damien explained everything he had uncovered, his father's involvement, Franklin's confession, the deliberate manipulation designed specifically to fracture their trust, Elena listened in stunned silence, her hands trembling slightly as the full weight of the betrayal settled over her. Your own father did this, Elena said quietly, disbelief evident in her voice. Yes, Damien confirmed, his voice heavy with shame and anger. I am so sorry, Elena. I had no idea he would go to such lengths, simply to protect his outdated vision of what this marriage was supposed to represent. Elena remained silent for a long moment, processing everything she had just learned. I wanted so desperately to believe you were telling the truth, she admitted finally, but some small part of me could not fully silence the doubt Cordelia planted, no matter how much I wanted to trust you completely. I understand, Damien said gently, moving closer to her. Given everything your family has taught you about mine, it makes sense that doubt would take root so easily. I do not blame you for questioning my intentions, especially once faced with such convincing lies. Elena studied him carefully, searching his expression for any remaining trace of dishonesty, finding instead only genuine remorse and unwavering sincerity. I believe you, she said finally, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. I believe everything we have built together has been real, despite everyone working so hard to convince us otherwise. Damien pulled her gently into his arms, relief flooding through him at her words. We will find a way through this, he promised. Whatever obstacles my father continues placing before us, I refuse to let his manipulation define what we choose to build together. Elena nodded against his chest, though a quiet uncertainty still lingered within her, uncertain whether Gerald's interference had truly ended, or whether more difficult challenges still remained ahead, before they could fully claim the happiness they had both worked so hard, and endured so much, to finally discover together. That uncertainty proved justified sooner than either of them expected. 2 days later, Cordelia returned unannounced to the estate, apparently unaware that her involvement had already been exposed. Elena answered the door herself this time, her expression far cooler than during their first meeting. "I thought I would check in," Cordelia began smoothly, before Elena cut her off with quiet, controlled firmness. "I know who sent you," Elena said. "I know about your arrangement with Franklin, and I know exactly why you came here spreading lies about my husband's intentions." Cordelia's composed expression faltered slightly, though she attempted to recover quickly. "I only wish to warn you out of genuine concern," she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "You wish to be paid," Elena said flatly. "Do not insult me further by pretending otherwise. I would ask you to leave now, and I would strongly advise against involving yourself in my marriage again." Cordelia studied Elena for a long moment, clearly recalculating her approach now that her cover had been exposed, before offering a thin, humorless smile and turning to leave without further argument, disappearing down the driveway and out of their lives, at least for the time being. Elena closed the door firmly behind her, breathing out slowly, relieved to have confronted the woman directly rather than allowing the lingering doubt to fester any further. When she turned around, she found Damien standing quietly in the hallway, having witnessed the entire exchange. "You handled that beautifully," he said softly, pride evident in his voice. "I needed to face her myself," Elena said. "I could not continue feeling like a victim of someone else's manipulation without confronting it directly." Damien pulled her into a gentle embrace, relieved and proud in equal measure. "I am so sorry this happened to us," he said quietly. "I promise you, I will find a way to ensure my father cannot interfere in our marriage again." Elena rested her head against his shoulder, comforted by his words, though both of them understood that Gerald's resistance remained far from fully resolved, and that the true test of their bond might still lie somewhere ahead, waiting patiently for the moment when it would finally be forced fully into the light for both families to confront together. News of Cordelia's involvement eventually reached Victor Voss through Owen, who had grown suspicious after Elena mentioned the strange visits during a brief phone call earlier that week. Victor listened with quiet fury as Owen explained the full situation, his hands tightening around the arms of his chair. "That family truly has no limits," Victor muttered darkly. "Even now, even after everything, Gerald Cross continues finding ways to interfere and manipulate." "Father," Owen said carefully, watching Victor's expression harden further. "Perhaps it is time you spoke with Elena directly about all of this, rather than simply reacting from a distance. She has shown remarkable strength through all of it, and I believe she deserves your support rather than more strategic calculation from our side as well." Victor considered his son's words for a long moment, something shifting slowly behind his guarded expression. "Perhaps you are right," he admitted finally. "I have spent so long viewing this marriage purely as a strategic recovery that I neglected to consider what it has genuinely cost my daughter emotionally throughout this process." Owen nodded, relieved to see even a small crack forming in his father's rigid perspective. "Then perhaps it is time to visit her yourself," Owen suggested gently. "Not as a father overseeing a strategic arrangement, but simply as a father checking on his daughter's well-being." Victor remained quiet for a long moment, turning the suggestion over carefully in his mind, before finally nodding slowly, resolving to visit the Cross estate personally in the coming days, uncertain exactly what he intended to say once he arrived, but understanding clearly that his daughter needed more from him now than simple strategic oversight from behind closed doors. A car door slammed outside the Cross estate, and Elena looked up from her book to see her father walking briskly up the front steps, his expression unusually uncertain for a man who normally carried himself with unwavering confidence. She met him at the door herself, surprised by the unannounced visit. "Father," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "I did not expect you today." "I know," Victor said, his voice softer than usual. "Owen told me everything that happened, about the woman sent to manipulate your trust in Damien. I came because I wanted to speak with you directly, rather than continuing to manage this situation only through strategic distance." Elena studied her father carefully, sensing genuine concern beneath his typically controlled exterior. They settled together in the sitting room, and Victor took a long moment before speaking again, choosing his words with unusual care. "I built this marriage around restoring what our family lost," Victor admitted quietly. "I convinced myself that strategic recovery was the only measure of success worth pursuing. I did not fully consider what it might cost you personally, especially once genuine feelings became involved." "I have fallen in love with him, Father," Elena said honestly, watching his reaction carefully. "Despite everything our family's history taught me to believe, despite every reason I had to resist it, what Damien and I share is real." Victor was quiet for a long moment, processing her words carefully. "Then I am glad," he said finally, surprising her with the warmth in his voice. Whatever recovery this marriage brings our family, it means far more to me knowing that you have also found genuine happiness within it, rather than simply enduring another burden placed upon you by my ambitions. Elena felt tears forming unexpectedly at her father's words, relieved to finally hear him acknowledge her feelings rather than simply the strategic value of her marriage. "Thank you for saying that," she said softly. Their conversation was interrupted by Damien's arrival, who paused uncertainly in the doorway upon seeing Victor seated in the sitting room. Victor rose immediately, extending his hand toward his son-in-law with unexpected sincerity. "I owe you an apology," Victor said directly, surprising Damien with his candor. "I have spent so long viewing this marriage purely through the lens of strategic recovery that I failed to consider what my daughter's happiness truly required. Learning what your father attempted through that woman he sent, I understand now that you have fought just as hard as Elena to protect something genuine between you, despite obstacles from both sides of this old feud." Damien shook his hand firmly, genuinely moved by the unexpected gesture. "Thank you, sir," he said. "I promise you, whatever challenges remain ahead, my commitment to your daughter's happiness will never waver." Victor studied him carefully, nodding slowly with quiet satisfaction. "Then perhaps it is time both our families finally addressed this old conflict directly, rather than allowing it to continue poisoning the happiness the two of you have worked so hard to build together." That evening, Victor suggested arranging a direct meeting between himself and Gerald, believing that confronting the underlying resentment openly might finally offer some resolution, rather than allowing it to continue manifesting through secretive manipulation and quiet sabotage. Damien agreed cautiously, though he remained uncertain whether his father would be willing to participate in good faith, given his recent behavior. The meeting took place 3 days later, in a neutral setting, a private conference room at a hotel equidistant from both family estates. Gerald arrived precisely on time, his expression carefully guarded, while Victor waited already seated at the table, equally composed despite the tension clearly simmering beneath his calm exterior. "I assume you know why we are here," Victor said once Gerald had taken his seat. "I assume you intend to lecture me about interfering in my son's marriage," Gerald replied coolly. "I intend to remind you that this feud between our families has already cost both of us more than either of us can afford to keep losing," Victor said firmly. "Your father recognized that before he passed. It seems you have not yet reached the same understanding." Gerald's jaw tightened, though he said nothing immediately, clearly weighing his response carefully. "My father's guilt clouded his judgment in his final days," Gerald said finally. "I have spent my entire life managing the consequences of decisions made long before I had any say in them. And yet you continue making similar decisions yourself," Victor countered. "Manipulating your own son's marriage rather than allowing him the chance to build genuine happiness simply because it does not align with your rigid vision of strategic control." Gerald remained silent for a long moment, something shifting slowly behind his carefully guarded expression. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried less certainty than before. "Perhaps I have spent so long protecting this family's interests that I forgot to consider what genuine happiness actually requires," he admitted quietly, the words clearly difficult for him to acknowledge aloud. Victor studied him carefully, recognizing the reluctant honesty in his rival's tone. "Then perhaps it is time both of us finally allowed our children the chance to build something neither of us managed to achieve ourselves," Victor said. "A relationship built on genuine trust, rather than strategic calculation and decades-old resentment." Gerald considered this for a long moment, before finally nodding slowly, something resembling genuine reflection crossing his features for the first time since the conflict began. "Perhaps you are right," he admitted. "I will not pretend our family's history disappears simply through this conversation. But I am willing to consider stepping back from further interference, provided you extend the same courtesy from your side as well." Victor extended his hand across the table, and after a brief hesitation, Gerald accepted it, both men shaking hands with the weight of decades finally beginning to lift, at least partially, from between them. When Damien and Elena learned of the meeting's outcome later that evening, both felt a cautious sense of relief, understanding that while old wounds would not heal instantly, a genuine step toward reconciliation had finally been taken by both families, offering hope that their own happiness might finally be allowed to flourish, without constant interference from either side. That night, as they sat together on the same garden bench where their own understanding had first begun weeks earlier, Elena rested her head against Damien's shoulder, watching the stars slowly emerge across the darkening sky. "I never imagined our fathers agreeing on anything," Elena said softly. "Neither did I," Damien admitted. But perhaps this is exactly what my grandfather hoped for when he made his final request all those months ago. Not simply a marriage designed to close an old debt, but a genuine chance for both families to finally release the resentment that has poisoned them for far too long. Elena smiled softly, feeling for the first time since their wedding that the difficult road behind them might finally be leading towards something lasting and genuinely peaceful. Whatever challenges still remain ahead, she said quietly, I am grateful we found each other through all of this, however difficult the path to reach this moment truly was. Damien pressed a gentle kiss against her forehead, holding her close beneath the darkening sky. So am I, he said softly, so am I. Not everyone within either family greeted the news of reconciliation with equal enthusiasm. Priscilla, the distant cousin who had confronted the household staff on the wedding day, learned of the meeting between Victor and Gerald through a relative and immediately expressed her disapproval to anyone willing to listen. They cannot simply erase decades of history over a single conversation, she complained bitterly to a small gathering of relatives during a family dinner later that week. Our family lost everything because of the cross name. A handshake does not return what was taken from us. Similarly, Walter, the elderly cross-uncle who had confronted Victor during the wedding reception, grumbled openly about Gerald's apparent softening toward the Voss family, muttering to anyone nearby that sentiment had clearly clouded his nephew's judgment in his old age. Despite these lingering pockets of resistance, both Gerald and Victor remained committed to the fragile truce they had established, understanding that changing the hearts of every relative and distant cousin would take considerably longer than a single meeting, yet still believing firmly that the effort toward genuine peace was worth pursuing, regardless of how slowly broader acceptance might come. Damien and Elena, meanwhile, continued strengthening their own bond in the weeks that followed, no longer burdened by the constant undercurrent of manipulation and suspicion that had defined the earlier months of their marriage. They spent more time together exploring the city, visiting the lake house on quiet weekends, and slowly introducing each other more fully into their respective family circles, without the fear of hidden agendas working against them. One afternoon, Lucas visited the estate and found Damien in noticeably better spirits than he had witnessed in months, laughing genuinely as Elena teased him about his terrible attempt at preparing a simple dinner recipe she had taught him earlier that week. I have never seen you this relaxed, Lucas observed, smiling as he watched the easy affection between them. I never expected to feel this way, given how everything began, Damien admitted. But somehow, despite every obstacle placed before us, Elena and I found something worth fighting for, and I intend to continue protecting it for the rest of our lives together. Elena smiled warmly at his words, reaching for his hand and lacing her fingers through his own, the familiar warmth passing gently between them, no longer a source of confusion or fear, but simply a quiet, comforting confirmation of everything they had already chosen to build together, regardless of whatever old resentments still lingered faintly around the edges of their otherwise steadily brightening future. A sudden fire alarm blared through the Cross estate late one evening, sending staff rushing through the hallways in confusion, and Damien immediately grabbed Elena's hand, guiding her quickly toward the nearest exit as smoke began drifting faintly from the direction of the kitchen. It turned out to be a small, contained fire caused by an overheated electrical wire, extinguished quickly by staff before it could spread further, yet the sudden scare reminded both Damien and Elena, once again, how quickly everything precious could be threatened without warning. Standing together outside in the cool night air, watching firefighters confirm the situation had been fully resolved, Elena leaned into Damien's side, grateful once again for the steady presence he had become in her life. It seems this house enjoys testing us at every turn, she said, managing a small, relieved laugh once the danger had clearly passed. Perhaps it simply wants to remind us not to take anything for granted, Damien replied, wrapping his arm protectively around her shoulders. As the excitement settled and staff began returning to their normal duties, Victor and Gerald, who had both been invited to dinner that evening as part of their continuing efforts toward reconciliation, stood together near the entrance, having rushed outside during the commotion as well. It seems even fate insists on testing this fragile peace between us, Gerald said dryly, watching the firefighters coil their hoses back onto the truck. Victor allowed a small, genuine smile, an expression rarely seen on his typically composed face. Then perhaps that only proves how strongly it deserves protecting, he replied. The following weeks brought a steady stream of small, meaningful moments that gradually transformed the uneasy truce between both families into something resembling genuine acceptance. Gerald, though still reserved by nature, began attending family gatherings hosted by the Voss family, slowly extending careful courtesy toward relatives he had once viewed purely through the lens of old resentment. Victor, in turn, made efforts to understand Damien beyond his family name, recognizing gradually the genuine character his daughter had fallen in love with. Owen and Lucas, having met briefly during one of these gatherings, discovered an unexpected friendship of their own, bonding over their shared protective instincts toward Elena and Damien throughout the difficult months leading up to this fragile new peace. Their easy camaraderie became a small but meaningful symbol of how thoroughly the old divisions between both families were finally beginning to dissolve. Margaret Ashcombe, upon hearing news of the reconciliation during a brief visit several months later, expressed quiet satisfaction at how completely Edmund's final wish had ultimately been fulfilled, far beyond what even he had likely imagined possible when he first proposed the marriage from his deathbed. He always believed the bond between fated pairs carried the power to heal wounds far beyond simple personal happiness, Margaret said, sitting with Damien and Elena in the same garden where she had first shared Edmund's old family legend. It seems he was entirely correct. Elena smiled warmly, recalling how frightened and uncertain she had felt the very first time Margaret shared that story, unable then to imagine how completely her life would transform in the months that followed. "I am grateful he saw something in us that we could not yet see in ourselves," she said quietly. "As for the doubts we carried, and the fears we allowed to nearly divide us," Damien added, reaching for Elena's hand, "perhaps they were simply necessary steps toward understanding just how strong our bond truly needed to become in order to survive everything working against it." Margaret nodded approvingly, pleased to see the couple she had quietly hoped for since Edmund's passing finally settled so completely into genuine happiness together. In the months leading up to that celebration, the business world that had long watched the rivalry between the Cross and Voss families with quiet fascination began noticing the shift as well. Old partners who had once refused to work with both families simultaneously found themselves cautiously reconsidering, as Victor and Gerald began appearing together at industry functions, their guarded but genuine cooperation slowly restoring stability to markets that had suffered for years under the weight of their competing interests. Franklin, who had once orchestrated Gerald's scheme against the young couple, approached Damien privately one afternoon, his usual composed confidence replaced by visible discomfort. "I wanted to apologize directly," Franklin said quietly. "I followed your father's instructions without fully considering the harm it might cause you and your wife. It was wrong of me, regardless of my loyalty to him." Damien studied him carefully before responding. "I appreciate you saying that," he said finally. "I will not pretend it did not cause real damage, but I recognize that you were following orders from a man used to commanding absolute loyalty. I hope, moving forward, you use better judgment when asked to act against your own conscience." Franklin nodded gratefully, relieved by the measured grace in Damien's response, and their working relationship gradually settled into something resembling mutual respect over the following months, neither fully forgetting what had happened, yet both willing to move forward productively regardless. Cordelia, for her part, quietly disappeared from both families' social circles entirely, her reputation among mutual acquaintances damaged beyond repair once word of her manipulation eventually spread through careful, deliberate conversations Elena and Nora arranged among trusted friends, ensuring she would find it considerably more difficult to attempt similar schemes against anyone else in the future. Meanwhile, Priscilla and Walter, the two relatives who had voiced the loudest resistance to the growing reconciliation between families, gradually softened their positions as well, worn down slowly by the persistent example set by Victor and Gerald's continued cooperation, and eventually by the undeniable happiness radiating from Damien and Elena whenever the extended families gathered together. By the time the anniversary celebration arrived, even they attended without complaint, sitting quietly among relatives from both sides, finally beginning to accept that the old feud no longer served any meaningful purpose within their lives. Nearly a year after their difficult wedding day, Damien and Elena decided to host a large gathering at the estate, inviting both families together, not for strategic necessity, but simply to celebrate how far they had all come since that tense, joyless ceremony beneath the white flowers in the garden. The atmosphere this time carried none of the underlying hostility that had defined their wedding day. Laughter filled the air freely, relatives from both sides mingling comfortably. Old grudges finally softened enough to allow genuine warmth to flourish between people who had once viewed each other only through the lens of decades-old resentment. Victor and Gerald stood together near the edge of the celebration, watching their children dance together in the center of the garden, the same warmth passing visibly between Damien and Elena that had first sparked, however faintly, on their wedding day so many months earlier. "I never imagined I would stand here watching this with anything other than reluctant tolerance," Gerald admitted quietly. "Nor did I," Victor agreed, "yet here we are." "Here we are," Gerald repeated, and for the first time in over 40 years, something resembling genuine peace settled fully between the two men. The old feud finally, truly beginning to fade into history, rather than continuing to shape the futures of those who had inherited it, without ever choosing it themselves. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and guests slowly began departing, Damien and Elena found a quiet moment alone, near the same stone bench where they had first acknowledged their growing connection so many months before. Elena rested her head against Damien's shoulder, watching the stars begin their slow emergence across the darkening sky above them. "Do you ever think about how different everything could have turned out?" Elena asked softly, "if we had allowed fear, or doubt, or our family's resentment to keep us apart?" "I try not to imagine that version of our lives," Damien admitted, pressing a gentle kiss against the top of her head. "I am simply grateful that whatever force brought us together, whether fate, chance, or something neither of us can fully explain, it proved strong enough to carry us through everything that tried to tear us apart." Elena smiled, lacing her fingers through his own, the familiar warmth passing between them exactly as it had on their wedding day, no longer strange or uncertain, but simply a comforting reminder of everything they had built together, despite every obstacle placed before them. "I love you," Elena said softly, meaning the words completely, without hesitation or doubt, for the first time truly free from the weight of old resentments and family expectations that had once threatened to define their entire relationship. "I love you too," Damien replied, holding her close beneath the star-filled sky. Completely, and without any reservation. They sat together quietly for a long while afterward, watching the last of their guests depart. Both families finally united not through strategic necessity or old debts, but through genuine understanding and hard-won trust. What had begun as a forced arrangement between two bitter enemies had transformed, through fear, near tragedy, painful betrayal, and ultimately unwavering commitment, into something neither of them had ever expected to find. A partnership built on genuine love, strong enough to heal wounds that had lasted for generations, and enduring proof that even the deepest inherited conflicts could finally give way to something far more powerful, once two people chose, deliberately and completely, to build something real together, despite everything working against them.